I've never been the type to scare easily. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods, and nights were quiet except for the occasional owl or the rustling of leaves. So when I moved into my little suburban house, I thought I'd left all my childhood fears behind. The neighbors were friendly, the streets were safe, and I never worried much about locking my doors. That changed one night, and I still haven't been able to shake the feeling that someone is watching me. It started with little things. I'd come home and find the back door unlocked, even though I could have sworn I locked it before leaving for work. Other times, my kitchen drawers were slightly open, just enough to notice. I thought I was just being forgetful. I even laughed it off with some coworkers, telling them how my brain was probably going early. They told me to get a camera just to be safe. I didn't listen. One evening I got home later than usual. The sky was already dark, and the streetlights were casting long, eerie shadows on the sidewalk. As I stepped inside, the air felt heavier, like the house had been holding its breath. I brushed it off and headed straight to the kitchen. That's when I noticed something that made my stomach churn. A glass of water was sitting on the counter. I hadn't been home all day, and I didn't leave it there. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd poured it this morning and forgot. Maybe it was left from the night before. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made my skin crawl. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that the house was settling, or that it was the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I decided to set up a few cameras around the house. I told myself it was for peace of mind, that I'd watch the footage later and laugh at how paranoid I was. I left for work, already feeling a little better about my decision. When I got home that night, everything seemed normal. I cooked dinner, watched some TV, and tried to forget about the weird feeling that had been following me. Before bed, I checked the cameras out of curiosity. The footage from the living room looked fine. Just an empty room all day. I switched to the camera in the kitchen. That's when I saw it. Around noon, a man walked into the frame. He didn't look rushed or panicked. He just strolled into my kitchen like he owned the place. He opened the fridge, took out a soda, and sat down at the table. I watched, frozen, as he stayed there for nearly an hour, just sitting and drinking. Then he got up and left, walking back the way he came. My first thought was to call the police, but then I realized I didn't know where he had gone. He didn't leave through the front or back door. He just walked out of the kitchen and disappeared. I rewound the footage and watched again, this time paying closer attention. That's when I saw it. Just before he left the kitchen, he glanced at the camera and smiled. I couldn't breathe. That smile felt like a challenge, like he was daring me to do something about it. I checked the rest of the footage, but there was no sign of him anywhere else in the house. It didn't make sense. He had to have gone somewhere, but I couldn't figure out where. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept every light in the house on and sat in my living room with a knife in my hand. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that there had to be some logical explanation, but every so often I'd think about that smile, and I'd feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The next day, I called a locksmith and had all my locks changed. I also added deadbolts to every door and put bars on the windows. For a while it helped. The house felt safer, and I started to believe that maybe the man was just a drifter who had somehow gotten inside. Maybe he didn't mean any harm. But then, about a week later, I found a note on my kitchen table. It was a single word, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "Why?" I don't know how he got back in. The locks were all secure, and there was no sign of forced entry. But somehow, he had been there again. I decided to stay with a friend for a few days while I figured out what to do. When I came back to the house, I found another note. This one said, "You can't hide. I haven't been back since. I sold the house and moved to another state, but I still don't feel safe. Every time I hear a noise in the middle of the night, I wonder if it's him. I wonder if he's found me again, and I wonder what he'll do if he ever does. I used to love living alone. It was quiet, peaceful, and I could come and go as I pleased without having to answer to anyone. I had my own little routine, and I liked it that way. My house wasn't big, just a small 2-bedroom place on the edge of town, but it was mine. I never thought twice about safety. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids played outside until dark. But now I can't walk through my own front door without feeling like I'm being watched. It started a few months ago. I was sitting in the living room late one night, scrolling through my phone when I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind. A faint rustling sound, almost like someone dragging their fingers along the walls. It was so soft that I told myself I must be imagining things. But then it happened again. This time it was louder, like a shuffle or a scrape. I got up and checked the house, even opened the front and back doors to look outside. Nothing. The night was still, and my yard was empty. Over the next few days, the sounds got worse. It was always at night, and it always seemed to come from the walls. I told myself it was probably mice or maybe even squirrels. I set some traps, hoping to catch whatever was making the noise. For a while it stopped, and I thought the problem was solved. Then one night, I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing. It wasn't close, but it was there, faint and steady, like someone standing just on the other side of the wall. My chest tightened, and I stayed frozen in bed, straining to hear more. The breathing stopped after a few minutes, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I called an exterminator the next morning. I told him about the noises and the breathing, and he laughed a little, saying it was probably just a raccoon. He said he'd check the attic and crawl spaces and seal up any holes he found. When he was done, he said everything looked fine. No signs of pests, no openings for them to get in. I wanted to believe him, but something felt off. That night I locked every door and window and pushed furniture in front of them for good measure. I felt ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to watch TV to distract myself, but I kept glancing at the walls, expecting to see something. The house felt too quiet, like it was waiting for something to happen. Around 2 a.m. I heard it again. This time it wasn't just rustling. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving inside the walls. I grabbed a flashlight and started walking through the house, my hands shaking. The sound followed me, always just a step ahead or behind. Like whoever it was wanted me to know they were there. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed. Nothing. I was about to go back to my room when I noticed something strange. The door to the basement, which I always kept locked, was slightly open. My stomach dropped. I didn't even remember the last time I'd gone down there. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the door. I told myself not to go down, that it was probably nothing, but I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed a kitchen knife and slowly made my way down the stairs. The basement was cold and damp, and the smell of mildew hit me like a wall. I shined the flashlight around, looking for anything out of place. The room was empty, just boxes and old furniture covered in dust. Then I saw it. In the far corner, where the wall met the floor, there was a small opening. It wasn't big, maybe just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was there. The edges of the hole looked freshly chipped, like someone had been working on it recently. My heart started racing as I crouched down to get a closer look. The air coming from the hole was warm and smelled faintly of sweat. I backed away, panic setting in. I ran upstairs, locked the basement door, and called the police. I told them everything. About the noises, the breathing, the hole in the basement. They said they'd send someone over to check it out. I sat in the living room, gripping the knife, waiting for them to arrive. When the officers got there, they searched the house and the basement. They found the hole, but they said it was probably just from an old drainage system or something. I asked them about the noises, about the breathing, and they shrugged it off, saying houses make weird sounds sometimes. They told me to call back if I heard anything else and left. I didn't stay in the house that night. I went to a friend's place and stayed there for a few days. When I finally worked up the courage to go back, everything seemed normal at first. The house was quiet, and the hole in the basement had been sealed up. I tried to convince myself it was over, that I'd been overreacting. But then, last week I found something that made my blood run cold. I was cleaning the guest bedroom, a room I rarely went into, when I noticed the closet door was open. Inside, on the floor, was a small pile of wrappers and an empty water bottle. Next to it was a blanket, crumpled and dirty, like someone had been sleeping there. I haven't been back since. The police are investigating, but I don't think they'll find him. Whoever he is, he's good at hiding. And I don't think he's gone. I've always considered myself cautious. I double-check locks, keep my curtains drawn at night, and never let strangers into the house. Maybe that's why I'm still alive to write this, or maybe I was just lucky. Either way, I haven't been the same since that night. It started around 11 p.m. I was in bed, scrolling through my phone with the sound of rain tapping against the windows. My house is a single-story place on the outskirts of town. It's quiet, surrounded by woods, and the nearest neighbor is about a 5-minute walk away. Normally I love the solitude, but that night it felt oppressive. I remember hearing a faint tapping sound. At first I thought it was just the rain, but something about it was off. It wasn't steady, and it wasn't coming from the windows. It sounded like it was coming from inside the house. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the house settling or a branch scraping the siding. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to check the house, more to calm my nerves than anything else. I grabbed my phone for light and walked through the living room, the kitchen, and the hallway. Everything looked fine, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. I went back to my room and tried to ignore it. About an hour later I heard it again. This time it was louder and more deliberate. It was coming from the hallway, like someone was dragging their fingernails along the walls. My chest tightened, and I froze in bed, straining to hear more. The sound stopped, and the house went completely silent. I told myself to get up and look again, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I already knew I wouldn't want to see what was out there. After a few minutes, I worked up the courage to grab a flashlight and step into the hallway. The air felt heavy, and the shadows seemed darker than usual. I moved slowly, shining the light ahead of me. As I reached the end of the hall, I noticed the door to the spare bedroom was slightly open. I always keep it closed. My stomach dropped. I pushed the door open the rest of the way, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. I shined the flashlight around, checking every corner, even under the bed. Nothing. I felt a small wave of relief and decided I was just being paranoid. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something on the window. It was a smudge like someone had pressed their hand against the glass. I leaned closer and realized it wasn't just a handprint. It was a face. The outline was faint, but I could see the shape of a nose, a mouth, and 2 dark spots where the eyes had been. My heart started pounding as I backed out of the room and closed the door. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light in the house on, clutching a kitchen knife and waiting for morning. By the time the sun came up, I had convinced myself it was just condensation, or maybe even my own imagination. I decided I'd call someone to check the house later, just to be safe. That afternoon, I went outside to look at the spare bedroom window. The smudge was still there, clear as day. But what chilled me to the bone was that it was on the inside of the glass. I felt like I was going to be sick. I tried to think of how it could have gotten there. No one had been in that room for weeks, and I knew I hadn't touched the window. I called a friend to come over, and we checked the house from top to bottom. Every door was locked, every window secure. We didn't find anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had missed something. My friend tried to reassure me, saying it was probably nothing, but I could tell they didn't believe it either. That night, I locked myself in my bedroom and pushed a dresser in front of the door. I kept the knife under my pillow and left the lights on again. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, moving toward my room. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might stop. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. Then I heard a soft scratching, like fingernails dragging across the wood. I gripped the knife so hard my hands started to cramp. The scratching continued for what felt like hours before it finally stopped. I waited until sunrise before moving the dresser and opening the door. The hallway was empty, but there were scratches on the outside of my bedroom door, deep and jagged, like someone had been trying to claw their way in. I called the police, but they didn't take me seriously. They said it was probably an animal or some prankster messing around. I couldn't stay in that house after that. I packed a bag and left that same day, moving in with a relative until I could figure out what to do. I hired a company to clear out the place and change the locks, but I've never gone back. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if maybe I was just tired or stressed and my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I remember the scratches, the face on the window, and the sound of those footsteps in the hallway. I know someone was in my house, and I know they weren't planning to leave. I've always felt a bit paranoid about my safety, even though I live in a quiet suburban area. I lock my doors religiously, check the windows before bed, and keep a few lights on at night. It probably sounds silly, but it's just how I've always been. I didn't think anything could happen to me. That is, until one night when I found out I was wrong. It started with something small, a noise, a faint sound coming from upstairs. I told myself it was probably just the house settling. The creaks and groans of old homes are something I've learned to ignore. But this time it didn't feel like just a creak. It was different. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it again. A footstep. It was soft but deliberate, like someone was walking in the hallway. I sat up in bed, my heart beginning to pound. I held my breath, straining to hear. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of someone moving through my house. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was in here. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and called 911. I whispered as I gave them my address, hoping whoever was in the house wouldn't hear me. The dispatcher promised help was on the way, but that didn't make me feel any better. The house was quiet again, and for a moment I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then I heard it again, a footstep louder this time, and it was closer. I slowly crept out of bed, moving quietly to the bedroom door. I peeked down the hallway, and for a second I thought I saw something shift in the shadows. My pulse raced, but I didn't move. Whoever was in my house was close. I was trapped. I backed into the bedroom and locked the door. My mind raced. Should I make a run for it? Should I hide? But no, if I moved I'd make a sound, and they'd know I was awake. So I stayed there, frozen, waiting for the next sound, waiting for them to make their move. The minutes dragged on. Every little noise in the house seemed amplified, my breathing, the soft creak of the floorboards. But then something happened that sent chills down my spine. I heard the door handle to my bedroom jiggle. Whoever it was, they knew I was inside. They were coming for me. I backed away from the door, my hand covering my mouth to stifle the frantic breathing. The door rattled again, but it didn't open. I held my breath, praying that whoever it was would give up and leave. But then came the sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. They were leaving, I thought. Maybe I had a chance. But then I heard something even worse, a soft thud, like something heavy hitting the floor. It came from the living room. I couldn't help myself. I had to see what was happening. I crept out of my bedroom, slowly, cautiously, my phone still clutched in my hand. I tiptoed down the hallway, and as I reached the living room doorway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The front door was wide open. I didn't remember leaving it open. I was sure I'd locked it earlier when I got home. But there it was, hanging ajar, and a figure stood just inside the doorway, partially hidden in the shadows. They weren't moving, but I could feel their presence. My legs felt weak, but I couldn't look away. The figure didn't seem to notice me. It was as if they were waiting, listening for something, watching for movement. I had no idea what to do. I couldn't call the police again. They'd be too late by the time they got here. I needed to make a decision. Fast. I decided to move quietly like a shadow. I made my way to the kitchen, hoping I could find something to defend myself with. My mind raced. What was going on? Who was in my house? Why were they here? I grabbed a knife from the drawer, my hand trembling as I held the handle. I knew I couldn't just wait for them to find me. I needed to take control of the situation, but I was scared. I was terrified. I crept back toward the living room, every step feeling like an eternity. I peeked around the corner, and that's when I saw him. The figure was no longer standing in the doorway. He was moving slowly, silently, toward the kitchen. I barely had time to react before I saw him look up, his eyes locking onto mine. I didn't think. I ran. I bolted out the back door and into the yard, not looking back until I reached the street. My hands were still shaking, and I couldn't catch my breath. The adrenaline was overwhelming. I didn't stop running until I reached my neighbor's house. I knocked frantically, and they let me in, looking at me like I was crazy. I was out of breath, on the verge of tears, but I couldn't explain it all in that moment. I couldn't say the words. I just needed to be somewhere safe. The police came shortly after. They searched the house, but by then, the intruder was long gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no clues, nothing that could explain what had happened. It was as if the whole thing had been a nightmare. But it wasn't. I knew what I'd seen. I knew someone had been in my house. It's been weeks since that night. I moved out of that house, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that someone is always watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. I don't know who he was or why he was there, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes. I'll never forget the look. If you ever hear a noise in your house at night, don't ignore it. It could be the last mistake you make. There was something.